Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy. I'm a writer and a writing instructor in higher education. And this is an educational YouTube series meant to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversation with other writers. Andrew Bode-Lang is the author of fiction chapbook Field Trips with Exceptional People. His poems and short stories have appeared in journals including Beloit Fiction Journal, Epic, the Greensboro Review, New Letters, Ninth Letter, Poetry East, and Rattle. He has an MFA from University of Arizona, lives in State College, Pennsylvania, and is an associate teaching professor in English at Penn State. This is my conversation with Andrew. Hi, how are you?
Good, it's good to see you.
You too. So what's going on?
Surviving a global pandemic. How about you?
Same.
Yeah. I confess I'm a little nervous, but we'll roll on.
Oh, I am terrified. Every time I do one of these things, I'm terrified. But what I find is it doesn't actually show up. The terror doesn't actually show up in the same way that I'm envisioning it in my head on the screen. So that's good.
Yeah, that is good.
I don't look like I'm about to wet myself in the videos, even though that's how I might feel in my head.
Not even a little bit.
What are you working on now and what motivated the project? So you have this book, Field Trips with Exceptional People. Tell me a little bit about that and some of the things that you're working on currently.
Okay, so my fiction chapbook is Field Trips with Exceptional People, and it really came out of a type of writing that I was doing that felt kind of more purely for my own entertainment and amusement than anything I'd ever done. And as I was working on them, there would be these short little adventures like riding in a hot air balloon with Robert Downey Jr., washing skyscraper windows with Janet Reno. So it's like all of these kind of bizarre juxtapositions. And I just had fun going on those adventures for myself and realized after a while that I was building something and that they fit together, and published it as a chapbook with Redbird Chapbooks, who are wonderful. What I'm working on right now is very different though. My MFA is in poetry, and I'm kind of back to writing poems again, and have been for the last handful of years after I took a period, maybe 5 or 7 years of not writing any poetry at all, really just writing short fiction and trying a few other things in a fiction vein, like writing for kids and things like that. And writing poems kind of reintroduced itself to me, and I hadn't known how much I'd been missing it and how much I'd been lacking for not doing it. But the poems that I'm writing now are kind of coalescing into a manuscript of their own that's about as far from Field Trips with Exceptional People as you can get. And really the thing that kind of drew me back to poetry and made me realize I had some work to do that I could only do in poems was really two things that happened pretty much at the same time. Our daughter was born, she's 5.5 now. And that was a transformative life experience. And I stayed home with her for 2 years before I went back to teaching. So doing that, and also at about the same time, my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I didn't know that until our daughter was about 1 year old when my parents told us. They'd not wanted to tell us, right when our daughter was born. But relationships with parents can be very complicated in a lot of different ways. And a diagnosis like that, it's a very defining thing. And so really those two things, becoming a parent and having one of my parents in a way kind of prematurely be taken, as her ability to speak and to remember has kind of disappeared. So a lot of the poems that I've been writing over the past few years are really mining both of those veins in different ways.
Thank you. That is a great answer. And actually, what I found with strangers with or field trips with exceptional people, there are a couple of stories that I teach out of that when I teach Introduction to Creative Writing. We start with creative nonfiction, then go into fiction, and then poetry. And I find that at least a couple of stories that I've taught from it is the baking scones with George Clooney and grocery shopping with Helen Mirren. I find that makes a really good bridge between the nonfiction and the fiction, because it's sort of like when students get to that fiction unit, they're like, holy crap, how the hell do I create a character, right? Mm-hmm. And this makes that nice bridge because, okay, while the author, the writer, and the even the I in the collection itself may not intimately know these figures, we still have to understand them as their personas, right? So how do we know it's George Clooney? How do we know it's Helen Mirren? How do we know it's Janet Reno, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really good way to help them understand how to create characters on the page, right? And so then they can get to the fiction aspects a little bit more easily without creating those static, flat, cardboard, stereotypical characters. And I think it's really interesting what you're talking about in terms of the poetry motivations there. Relationships, parental relationships, it seems to be the major motivating factor here. So I think that leads us into the next question is, what have you learned about yourself through writing?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question a bit before we spoke, of course, and I think that one of the things when I think about the work that I'm doing now, writing about my own mother and my dad too, and writing about our daughter and writing about being a parent. I mean, a lot of it is that writing helps me to understand what I know about those things, or what I think or believe, or how my own memory fits into my story and how I understand it. One of the things that I'll say was that has been very interesting for me is that when those couple of life events happened, it was like there was nothing that there was no way that I could process them in writing fiction. And I'm just not a nonfiction writer, so it's like the tools that I had available that I was most working in, there was nothing that I could do there that was going to help me understand anything more. But poetry was the one kind of way that I felt like I could engage with it in a way that helped me to understand. And I think that as far as poetry goes, that's one of the very big and important to me things that poetry does, help me to understand my experience. And it also, I feel, helps me to focus my attention. I really love haiku. I kind of aspire to reducing the size of my work down to that kernel, that essence. And the remarkable thing about haiku is it's just pure attention, just pure crystallized attention. And that's what I want my writing to do for me. I feel like my life deepens and increases when my attention is most focused and most rich. And when my attention is off in other places, or it's kind of fragmented, I feel like I'm kind of skimming the surface. And I've gone back and forth because I do write fiction and poetry, and there are times when I'll think, oh, I'm a fiction writer, forget about poetry. I'm a poet, forget about fiction. And I still have that inclination. It's really hard not to bounce back and forth and think I need to be just one thing or another. But I do find also that I kind of engage in the practice of writing each form in a very different way. And very often I find that I feel like I'm living in a way that feels more grounded and kind of healthy for me when I'm writing poetry. And I think those field trips are kind of exceptions because I just had so much fun writing those. But a lot of the fiction I write is frankly dark and bleak, And like if I spend a lot of time in those places, I just don't feel like I'm learning anything except that there's darkness and bleakness. So I guess that really at its root, what I found out most through writing is something about how I want to live and where I want my attention to be and what I want to try to know. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I think that gives us a really good entry point into what is the role or responsibility of writing. So you're talking about this malleability, this flexibility in it. So what keeps you generating material? Why write?
A thing that I've felt for a long time about art in general is the art that I really value the most is art that kind of walks into the darkness empty-handed and comes out holding a light of some kind. And that's something that I value in what I experience and what I engage with as a viewer of visual art, as a reader. And it's something that I want my art to do for a reader, and I want it to do for me in my life. And that's the reason that I keep going back to it. And the things that I feel best about having created are the things where I was able to find that light and bring it.
Amazing. So when you're struggling to write for whatever reason, maybe it's time, maybe you're overwhelmed by ideas, underwhelmed by ideas, whatever it may be, even just trying to quiet the doubts in your head, what strategies do you use to get to the page?
This is a really pertinent question right now because of the pandemic. I mean, we're 15 months in at this point when you and I are talking, just a little over 15 months in. And in the last 15 months, I've been a full-time teacher and a full-time parent because my job has relatively flexible hours teaching. I've taught asynchronously. My wife's job is 9 to 5 every day or 8 to 5 every day. So I've been teaching full-time and staying home with our daughter, who we haven't had in school full-time. And I have written virtually nothing in the last 15 months. And I do feel disconnected from myself in that way. I feel disconnected from my work. Like I was really cooking on a lot of poems on the manuscript I was putting together, really feeling great about it and submitting stuff. And I've just put all of that, I've kind of banked that particular fire right now. And I don't regret that because of the things that I've been doing, being a dad, being present for our daughter, that's fundamentally more important to me than my writing. And I know that the writing is there. And one thing for me about my process just over the years is I don't mind letting the field go fallow for a while. Like there are times maybe I'm pushing myself too hard to do something, to try to make something work, a project, or to try to get a manuscript to work where not all the pieces are ready yet. Or I try to work on a certain kind of writing or something, and I'm just forcing something. If I back off and let myself be for a bit, when I come back to it, I come back knowing something more, and I come back refreshed and new things are coming out. And so that's a complicated answer in the right now. Kind of in a practical sense, when I am working consistently, like say 16 months ago, the way that I kind of organize things for myself is if I don't feel like writing something new, I'm going to revise. And if I don't feel like revising, I'm going to submit. And I can always spend time on one of those three things. And it keeps me focused. And if I'm submitting, I feel excited about what I was working on, I'll probably start editing and then I might start writing.
So what revision strategy or strategies do you find most useful for revising your own work? What sort of problems or challenges do these activities help you solve?
That's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And this is thinking about at a time when I'm not really working on my writing, but thinking about how, just art in general is made up of meaningful structures and patterns. And the work of the artist is to create those meaningful structures or patterns or find them in some material that we generate and to kind of, bring them into relief, to bring them out. And that's, I feel like, the place where I keep working at my craft and trying to learn and do the next thing that I can do is to, and I don't think that a structure necessarily has to be complex to be meaningful or to be valuable. Like take a haiku again, which I value enormously. Nobody's going to call that as elaborate a structure as an incredibly sophisticated long novel that covers multiple time frames and characters and so forth. But it requires, if anything, even more rigor. So the thing that I'm always trying to do is think about how to identify and capitalize upon those patterns. And I don't even mean just like physical structural patterns, but what's being spoken of, how it's being spoken of. And one kind of practical thing that I do, particularly in poetry, and it really comes of having noticed for years a pattern of weakness in a lot of my writing, just like places where the line goes slack, the sentence goes slack, just there's not as much energy in the language. I've really started in recent years writing a much shorter line and a much more, I think, controlled line than I ever did. And sometimes in the revision process, I'll chop my lines down much shorter. And you notice weak stuff and you have to get rid of it. When every line is just like 3 or 4 or 2 words long, if something's not carrying its weight, it's got to go. And that helps me focus. And I also use stanza in the same way. I'll usually write something as a long column and then I'll break it into stanzas of 3 lines, 2 lines, and try stuff out. And every time I make a change, I'm cutting stuff from it or I'm strengthening something. And so messing with the really physical structure helps me to identify where I'm making the most of the meaning in the patterns and where I'm not, and edit for that. And in fiction, I don't think I'm quite as good at parsing that stuff out. So I end up just for fiction starting at the first word and reading through to the last word, making changes as I go. And I might do that 100 times, just like trying to get my 4 pages or 10 pages or 20 into something that sings a little better.
And what is your favorite part of the writing process? Which part do you enjoy the most and why?
There are 2 parts and they're really at opposite ends. Like one is the moments of kind of places where your mind is associating in ways that you're not necessarily prepared for, and something comes up, you arrive at some truth that you kind of didn't know you were looking for, and you're able to do something with it. And the other is in the revision process, like where you're able to you're working at something and working at it, and suddenly you realize what you need to do to make it snap into focus and make it work. And both of those are really satisfying moments in their different ways. You can't always count on landing on the first every time you sit down to write, and you've got to work a long time to get to the second one. But I think I aspire toward being able to do more of the second and not rely so much on the first. I have a good friend, Laura Donnelly, who's actually coming to visit us today, who's a poet. She teaches at SUNY Oswego. And I taught her book, her most recent book, Midwest Gothic, in my poetry writing class this past semester. And I had her do a Zoom event with my class, and they were asking her about her revision process. And she studied piano performance in college before she started writing poems. And she said, and I love this, that one of the things that helped her to understand what she can do in her poems is just that act of practice. Like nothing is impossible to play. You just go over it and over it again until you can get it. And she's really tenacious about getting there. And I really admire that and kind of aspire toward that. And that brings me, I guess, to one other thing, which is, for most writers, there are people we share our work with and who we rely on. Laura's one of those people for me. Her husband, Ben Culp, is a fiction writer, and he's somebody I always share my fiction with. And also, most fortunately for me, my wife is a poet, and we met each other through our writing, and we share work with each other. And she reads my early drafts and tells me when I'm off track and when things don't make sense. And that's really useful to have around. We all need that. So.
What reading suggestions do you have? What writers do you keep in your back pocket? I'm assuming at least the two that you listed.
Yeah. The first thing I think of when I think of reading suggestions is, I've mentioned it a couple times, but haiku. And I really, really love haiku, and not everyone does. And there is kind of this tendency to dismiss haiku because of its smallness and because it's difficult to understand or appreciate what it's doing. I read this really great thing a little while ago that a guy said, you don't judge box music judges you. And I kind of feel the same way about haiku, So people dismiss it. I'm like, oh, you didn't give yourself to it. You need to give it another chance. So I feel that way. I also really love, and have loved since I was an undergrad, University of Michigan's Poets on Poetry series, where it kind of collects critical writing, essays, interviews, most particularly, which I love, with poets of all kinds. And those books are just an amazing storehouse of wisdom, knowledge, and experience from pretty much name your favorite writer, and they've done one or more of those books, and I really recommend those to all writers. I think everybody can benefit from that. And some of the writers who I really love and lean on, I've always loved Jane Kenyon, and William Stafford was a really formative early influence for me. I don't read him as much now, but just his receptivity, his willingness to go to the page and see what comes. And I really love Charles Simic, and those three don't really seem to fit together all that neatly, but they do for me. And more recently, I've really come to love Yusuf Kumunyaka's poetry. And I've loved him for a long time, but I think I've really begun appreciating not only what he says in the poems, but how he builds the poems. And it's really inspired me to think much more rigorously about my craft and the shape of what I do. And Marie Howe is another person I really admire for both of those reasons too. What she says and does in the poems, and how she says and does it, and how she builds it and shapes it. So those are writers who I love. And in fiction, a couple of people who I love and just go to all the time. Michael Chabon is one. I love his fiction. And one who many people have a closet appreciation for, and I adore, is John le Carré. I love spy novels, and he is just a brilliant, brilliant man. And his books, like you talk about form and structure, making meanings out of patterns. A complicated spy story requires an awful lot of that. And I stand in awe of the ability to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful list. And as someone who's 5'1.5", I can definitely appreciate don't dismiss the smallness. Thanks for hanging out and making time.
Well, thanks, Andy. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me here.